Mi'kmaq Member of Parliament Jaime Battiste is calling for a study that could lead to the amending of the Indian Act. The Liberal MP recently tabled a motion for a report that would look at the impacts of sections of the Indian Act that are often referred to as the second generation cutoff. It's our topic for this week's Truth and Politics panel. With us as always is Jennifer Laewetz, the CEO of Paskwâw Strategies, and Niigaan Sinclair, a columnist with the Winnipeg Free Press. Jennifer, Niigaan, great to see you. Jennifer, Jaime Battiste is calling for a study on the impacts of what's commonly known as the second generation cutoff. Can you give us some background on what that is?
Well, we know through the Indian Act that there were certain amendments that were made that basically the government dictates who belongs to nations across this country, especially through status cards. A lot of people know, they've heard the term 6-1, 6-2. That's essentially your kind of like indication on whether or not you're the generation of cutoff. So if ISC and the government of Canada determined that you are no longer eligible to pass along your treaty benefits to your children, that's where it ends. It's a little bit of a colonial tool. It's kind of taken that power and that autonomy away from nations to kind of decide who is a part of their membership and community and who should be able to access their treaty rights. And I think sometimes we kind of collude the difference between treaty rights and also benefits. And I think this is just more, of the government's control that has been there historically and continues to this day.
Niigaan, any sense of how many people have been affected by this in the last 40 years?
Well, one of them would be me, and there are many, many others. Approximately 225,000 people estimated have been impacted by the second generation cutoff. What Jen was speaking about, of course, was the edits that were made when there was an attempt to try to clarify and define Indigenous identity, and in a sincere attempt in lots of circles to bring people back into the fold of getting their status, getting access to their treaty and Indigenous rights. And there was a creation of a kind of formula model which said that if you married a non-Indigenous person, even if they were a Métis person or a person without status, there would be a blood quantum that sort of dilute the blood, as it were. So 6-1s often are considered to be sort of full bloods, even though they may not have 100% Indigenous blood. And then 6-2s are considered often half, even though that percentage doesn't quite match that as well. It's basically, do you have one status parent? And so I'm in that boat, particularly because my parents chose not to, or my dad lost his status, and then there was a number of issues that when we came back in the fold, I became a 6-2. So that means that those of us who are impacted, we have to make determinations of who do we marry, who do we make children with, will we be able to pass on our treaty and status rights? And then on top of that, communities have to then face the reality that it is the federal government that determines who belongs to what community. That's different than membership, but the federal government really has in its hands all of the tools to determine who is a part of a community, who gets rights from that community, and so on. It's really a colonial model.
Lots going on with this, Jennifer, and a complicated issue. What all could this study, or should this study that MP Battiste is calling for, look at?
I think realistically, this should go back to as far back as the historical archives will allow us to go back on what Europe's understanding was of our governance structures. As somebody that has, proficiency in Indigenous governance, that has been an area that I have found some difficulty in finding, especially when it comes to the research. I think I'm going to just need to make the trip myself one day. But there's disconnect, especially when it comes to what, Europe, when Europe was doing the surveillance and they were heavily monitoring our tribes and our people in order to bring in very oppressive and heavy legislation. There seems to be a gap on the understanding of what their interpretations were of women in leadership, even the process in which they put down this harsh legislation onto our people and how they intertwined that membership piece into it. Because as Niigaan was talking about, there is a difference between the membership and ISC's differing opinion on who belongs to a nation. But I think the problem for us is that nations are getting ready to start, revitalizing their governance structures, but they're going to need a little bit more understanding on those membership codes. How far does that go? And if they're completely reliant on ISC for funding models, unfortunately, nations are going to get in the position where they're going to be making hard decisions on who actually accesses programs on a nation, because if all of the program funding doesn't allow it to stretch beyond who is registered as a band member there, it's going to get really tricky. And I would love to see more information come out about this. If the federal government has an opportunity to do any studies and to look further into this, there is so much more historical context and research we could be uncovering.
Right. Niigaan, how important is it for First Nations to have a say in this, and not just members of Parliament and the Senate?
Receive the rights that our communities have fought for over a century and a half to maintain and to continue. The simple answer is to give our give membership back to First Nations. It's in many ways already existing for instance, Métis people. Métis people can make determinations of who is and who is not a Métis person. They usually use elements of blood or ancestry, but there's lots of different ways that the Métis Federation here in Manitoba have made determinations on memberships as well. First Nations should be able to have that kind of sense of sovereignty and that ability to be able to determine their own membership. We have membership codes, but those aren't rights making mechanisms. The federal government doesn't recognize membership codes as being able to denote rights or give rights. And so that's a real problem. And what ultimately, I think the First Nations be able to make decisions for themselves. The problem, of course, is the federal government doesn't want to acquiesce that control. They're fearful that we're going to somehow adopt everybody under the sun, and then the funding models, which are often per cap or per individual, will then suddenly balloon and make the federal government freak out. There's lots of ways that we can deal with this through being partners, through dealing with each other as human beings, and treating our nations truly as nations.
Jennifer, Niigaan, we're going to leave it there. We're going to be talking about cows and plows and a special anniversary for the University of Manitoba over on the podcast. Thanks to you both.
You gotcha.
Jennifer, cows and plows is always a hot topic, and this week some of the conversation involves your own nation. Can you tell us what's going on there?
Yeah, so the George Gordon First Nation and Treaty 4 Saskatchewan, we have not received our cows and plows or our agriculture benefits yet. It's been a pretty contentious issue, and a lot of people know that it's very political as well. Different chief stances on cows and plows has definitely shaped elections on our nations, things like that. Our nation's been, kind of slow moving, not because I think it's any fault of my nation, but more so that there seems to be a little bit of pressure and emphasis put on the government moving slowly. We did hit an election, and then things kind of came to a standstill. Our chief was on Facebook yesterday requesting band members to be emailing the deputy minister. I, however, did not do that. Cows and plows is just broken treaty promises that never were implemented. So we're, awaiting that. And I have a kind of a personal moral thing not to be fighting over settlements that realistically belong to not just me, but to my ancestors as well, and all of those broken promises that happened over time. So I'm just waiting it out and haven't figured out what I'll even do with that money yet. So
I could help you out with some ideas. Niigaan, why is cows and plows so controversial, do you think?
Well, first off, it's a lot of money. And for many communities, this will probably be, for those who don't have land settlements, for example, or maybe compensation packages for fires or floods, this will probably be the most amount of money many people in our communities will see in their lifetime in one particular settlement. And it also is controversial because when you settle cows and plows, you're really closing a chapter on your rights. You are saying to the federal government that the issue of agricultural benefits that were never provided for our ancestors, which resulted in this poverty, that's a closed issue. And I'm not saying it's a closed issue forever for our own people. I'm saying that for the federal government, it is a issue in which they can then turn to and say, well, your community agreed upon taking this X amount of dollars in order to no longer talk about the lack of agricultural benefits, and that could be wide-ranging. That could be something in which the federal government can hold a community to account and impact a whole different set of things. Could it impact future land settlements? Could it impact future infrastructure commitments? It could involve a whole different set of ways in which the community itself having this opportunity by giving individual payouts will then therefore lack the ability to be able to have a collective fund that can benefit the community at large. And there's many different decisions that are made, and of course chiefs, as Jen spoke about a minute ago, make many promises. Many chiefs, for example, make those per cap promises hoping that will gain them some political support, but it doesn't really then engage some of the problems within community. And I would much rather see Cows and Plows be a community fund creation, something in which all the community can make administration of, can make decisions on, can make wide-scale economic development projects that can be long-ranging and not just one-offs.
Jen, the chief of another First Nation in Saskatchewan recently said the federal government has stopped negotiating cows and plows settlements under the new Carney government, but Indigenous Services Canada says that's not the case and that 9 agricultural benefit claims have been settled since the election, representing $918 million. Why does there seem to be so much misinformation around these claims?
I think mostly because of how complex the negotiations are. You know, I had shared a post on Facebook a couple months ago now where individual people can actually go on the Government of Canada website to actually see the status of negotiations for every different nation. And it's not easy to find. And it's also not easy to navigate. I think when there's a lot of, people that are confused what cows and plows even is, how does it work? Every nation is handling it differently. There are so many different moving parts. So there's a lot of complexities, and the negotiations do not provide a lot of insight into how that process works. The election did scare people. There were chiefs out there saying, vote for this party over this one, because if you don't, you won't get your cows and plows. So I think there's been a lot of, really, really complex conversations happening around cows and plows. But I'm going to play the devil's advocate here, and that I think the government has been working on it. Not as fast as we may like, but I think my own nation is currently being worked on, and it's supposed to be coming down the pipe. So I don't think that it's completely stalled. I think there's just a lack of communication on what's actually going on.
Yeah. Niigaan also wanted to squeeze in something this week on the special day the University of Manitoba, your employer, had on Wednesday. The U of M Indigenous Studies Department reaching a milestone. Can you tell us all about it?
50 years. It was in 1975 that our department started our first classes at the University of Manitoba. We're not the oldest program in the country. We're the second oldest. We're actually tied with Lethbridge. And this Trent University is the oldest Indigenous Studies program in the country in Peterborough, Ontario. We are the second oldest, but we are producing the most amount of Indigenous professionals. This year we have 3,248 First Nations, Inuit, Métis students at the University of Manitoba. That's the highest in history. Every single one of them comes through our department or works with, lives with, studies with a person who has to take one of our mandatory credits. If you are a person at the University of Manitoba, you have to go through the Indigenous Studies department, taking one of our intro classes to become a doctor, lawyer, nurse, teacher, all of those different professions. It's pretty amazing to think about. We had many of our alumni there. Our very first president of the Indian, Inuit, Eskimo, Métis organization from back in 1974 that led a resistance movement led by the students that resulted in the department. Ovid McCurdy was there, who was the first president. We had Moses Okamal there, who was also one of a student back in 1975. We had students who came for the current life. We had graduate students, undergraduate students. We had even, big, huge markers from different people who have worked for us over the years. Verna Kirkness was there. Anyone who knows, these are people who fought for our language and our culture in the institutions of this country. And we even had our program cut in 1981. But Dr. Emma LaRocque, who we celebrated yesterday and we blanketed her, fought endlessly through a letter writing campaign. Who writes letters anymore? Well, back in 1981, that's what Emma LaRocque did to save our department and not have it be cut. We are created out of resistance, but we are created out of a great deal of love for both our knowledge systems, our elders, our cultures, but also how do we create employable people in the future.
Well, huge congrats to you and everybody who's worked on that department over the years, graduated from it. 3,248 students. I believe they said there was 55 back 50 years ago. So that's incredible stuff. Good stuff. Well, thanks to you both this week, as always.
Yep, Miigwech, thanks.
Thanks.